I built it from metal, wood, and faith. The rotor slowed, their whir fading into the distant hum of city life. He stepped out of the cockpit, the door sliding shut behind him with a whisper. The wind at this height carried no dust, no scent of earth, only the thin, sterile breath of progress. Applause echoed across the rooftop as the crowd surged forward. Camera flashes lit up his face like fireworks. Some shook his hand. Others simply stared at the helicopter behind him, disbelief in their eyes. A young journalist, no older than he had been when it all began, stepped closer. "Sir," she asked breathlessly, "how did it start?" "This machinite flies itself. No controls, no crew. The world is calling it a miracle." He looked at her, not with arrogance, not even with pride, just a kind of quiet memory. "It started," he said, "with a rusted tin can and an old wooden wheel I pulled from behind a barn. I was 12. I didn't even know what I was building. I just knew I had to build something that flew." The microphones leaned closer. His voice remained calm, grounded. There was no lab, no internet, just a shed that smelled of dried hay and oil, and a mind that couldn't let go of a single question. Why can birds fly, and we can't? He paused, looked up. The sky above was clear, unbroken. "I suppose I built this," he said, motioning to the sleek aircraft, "because something in me remembered the silence of a farm where everything creaked, dripped, moaned, and struggled to live. And in that silence, I heard flight. Manure, stars, and first blueprints. The farm didn't sleep. Even when the sky turned black and the only light came from the distant stars, something was always moving, lowing in the barn, rustling in the chicken coop, creaking in the wooden beams. He remembered waking up to the sound of boots on frozen ground. His father didn't walk. He stomped, half from habit, half to scare the frost away. His mother's voice came next, low and fast, already deep into the day's worries. The boy, not yet 12, would pull on mismatched socks and a patched-up jacket and step into the world with breath steaming like a kettle. Their farm was small, just 3 cows, a pig, some chickens, and an old, one-eyed goat that had survived 3 winters and outsmarted every fence they'd built. The barn leaned to one side like it was tired of standing. Everything they owned smelled of soil and smoke. But to the boy, it was a kingdom. Where others saw mud, he saw moving parts. The broken pulley above the feed stall became a wheel in his mind. The handle of a rusted pump sparked the image of a propeller. The goat's endless escapes, proof of design flaws. Every evening after chores, he'd sneak into the tool shed. That was his sanctuary. The light bulb there flickered. The walls were lined with spider webs, but the shelves held discarded motors, bent nails, old bearings, and screws in coffee tins. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he had to do it. He'd never seen a real helicopter, only a faded diagram in an old magazine left behind by a visiting cousin from the city. But it was enough. He started sketching, first on brown paper bags, then the backs of old calendars, rotors, arms, wings. He didn't know the right words for them, so he made up his own: sky claws, air sticks, the spinner. One night, after feeding the pigs, he sat alone outside the barn, grease on his hands, a coil of copper wire beside him. The stars above looked cold but steady, endless. His mother found him there and sat beside him, not saying a word. They watched the sky together. After a while, she said, "You'll break your back chasing things that don't feed the cow." He didn't reply. He just looked up, because something inside him whispered, "One day, I'll fly." The farm had a heart of its own. The farm breathed. It groaned in the wind, hissed in the cold, and murmured in the rain. It wasn't alive in the way people wear it. Didn't speak, but it had a rhythm, a pulse. You could feel it if you listened. Every morning began the same. The rooster crowed too early. The frost bit the skin. The boy's father opened the barn with a grunt, tugging at the swollen wooden doors, and the animals answered with a familiar chorus moose, snorts, clucks, and the goat's smug bleat. The cows needed milking. The pig troughs needed filling. The hay had to be moved. even when it was frozen solid. Everyone had a job, including the boy. He carried buckets, shoveled manure, and kept the old radio working with a mix of foil and prayer. The people who worked around them, neighbors, friends, sometimes strangers who just appeared with tired eyes and stayed for a season, had their own stories. There was the woman with a crooked back who swore at the chickens like they understood. The man with hands so cracked they bled every time he touched water, but still mended every tool in the village. And the quiet one who never smiled, but gave the boy his first pair of pliers. Life on the farm was a long loop. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. But within that loop were moments, and those moments mattered. One such moment came on a Wednesday, in the shadow of an old grain silo. The boy had found a broken fan motor in a pile of junk metal. It still spun barely, but the blades were crooked. He spent hours straightening them, testing the spin, listening to the vibration. When it whirred smoothly, he felt something inside him click into place. That night, while the others slept, he snuck into the shed. He wired the motor to a battery from an old lantern, tied paper wings to a stick, and held it to the spinning blades. It lifted barely, then crashed into the floor. Still, it had risen. He marked that day in his memory, not as a success, but as a beginning. Later that week, he approached the farm's old mechanic, a thin man with stained fingers and a cigarette always stuck behind his ear. "I want to build something that flies," the boy said. The man squinted at him. "Flies? You mean like an airplane?" "No," the boy said. "Smaller, smarter, maybe something that thinks." The man laughed, but not cruelly. He rummaged in the box and handed the boy a handful of copper wire. "You'll need a lot more than that." And so it began quietly, beneath the moans of cattle and the clatter of buckets, in the moments between work and sleep. The dream was alive. It had no name yet, but it was taking shape. The silence that hid the words. There were things you didn't say, not because they were bad, but because they were dangerous. The boy didn't understand why at first. He just noticed how the air in the kitchen changed when someone mentioned the man from down the road who left one night and never came back. His mother would shush his father with a glance. His father would stare into his bowl and change the subject. The boy learned early that there were words which, once spoken, couldn't be unspoken. There were no books about how the world worked, at least not the truth of it. Just old school books filled with slogans and portraits of men in uniforms. The boy read them, but they felt like cardboard. He wanted to know how things moved, why birds flew, why the wind changed direction. These books offered none of that. He started listening instead. At the post office, at the grain co-op, even in line at the bakery, people spoke carefully. Sometimes they whispered, sometimes they said nothing at all. Everyone seemed to carry a shadow on their back. At night, in their one-room home, the boy would hear the radio flick on softly, almost like a secret. His father kept it under a towel, so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Static, then voices in a different language, not Russian, not Ukrainian, something foreign, forbidden. One night the boy asked, "Who are they?" His mother hushed him. His father turned the volume down. "Just people," he said, "far away. Are they dangerous?" His father looked at him for a long time, then replied, "Number, but listening to them might be." The next morning, the radio was gone. Later that week, a man in a dark coat visited the farm. He didn't smile. He didn't touch anything. Just asked questions about their harvest, their equipment, their community involvement. The boy watched from behind a haystack. That night, his father burned a letter in the stove. Said nothing. The boy didn't ask. Instead, he went back to the shed. He took out his drawings, now hidden under a false floorboard, not because he was told to hide them, but because he felt they needed to be hidden. He worked on a new sketch, something more precise. 4 blades, a central hub, the beginnings of lift. Outside, the goat bleated in the dark. The wind picked up, dry and hollow. The boy didn't shiver. He just drew. Flight over the well. The wind was still that morning, the kind of stillness that made sounds echo differently, longer, softer. He took it as a sign. The well sat behind the barn, half covered in moss and shadow, unused since the hand pump was installed. It had always frightened him as a child, dark, silent, bottomless. Now it would become his testing ground. He had worked on the prototype for weeks. A metal frame built from a bicycle wheel. 4 crude wooden blades, cut from old shelving boards and sanded down with a rock. At the center, the salvaged fan motor, mounted on a plank wrapped in cloth to reduce vibration. Wires twisted together like nervous fingers, leading to a car battery someone had thrown out last winter. He didn't tell anyone, not his parents, not the mechanic, not even the goat who, admittedly, had a tendency to chew on wires. He carried the machine carefully, bundled in a grain sack. The walk from the shed to the well felt longer than usual. Every step made his heart pound louder. The silence of the farm was different this morning, like it was listening. He set the contraption at the well's edge, checked every bolt and connection one more time. Then he connected the wires to the battery. A moment of nothing, then a whine, low, then rising. The blade spun. He stepped back. The thing lifted. It lifted. It rose just above the lip of the well, wobbling, unstable but in the air. For 2 full seconds, it hung there like a breath held in time. Then it tilted. The battery slipped. The whole thing dropped into the well with a hollow splash. He stared after it, mouth dry. No anger, no regret, just awe. It had flown. He sat there for a long time, legs dangling over the stone edge, listening to the echo of water far below. His father found him later, grease on his face, a torn jacket, staring into the well like it was a mirror. "You lose something?" his father asked. The boy nodded. "Something big?" He hesitated, then said, "Number, something small, but the big part's coming." His father didn't ask more, just tousled his hair and walked back toward the barn. That night, the boy didn't sleep. He drew a new design, bigger blades, lighter frame, more power. He'd lost his first machine, but he'd found the one thing more valuable: proof. And in the shadows, beyond the fence line, someone had watched. A name on a list. Spring came late that year. The snow melted slowly, turning the yard into a swamp and the barnyard into a battlefield of mud and slush. But the boy didn't care. Something had changed since the flight over the well. He walked differently now, straighter, with a quiet certainty in his step. He began spending more time in the shed, often skipping meals, sometimes falling asleep on the workbench with oil on his hands. He was building again, this time better. He'd salvaged aluminum from an old stovepipe and fashioned new blades. He learned how to balance them by watching windmill vanes on a neighbor's field. The vibrations that once tore his machines apart were now nearly gone. But while his machine grew more stable, life around him became unsettled. It started with school. The teacher, a narrow-eyed man from the city, had always been cold, but lately he had grown inquisitive. He began calling on the boy more often, asking what he did after class, who he talked to, what books he read. "You're always scribbling," he said one day, holding up a page torn from the boy's notebook, a design for a multi-blade rotor. "What is this?" "A toy," the boy lied. "A dangerous toy," the teacher muttered. That week, the boy was called to the principal's office. The principal didn't smile either. "We've heard you're talented," he said. "There are technical youth programs in the city. State, run, serious places, discipline, structure." The boy nodded, said nothing. He knew what those places were. His cousin had been sent to one. He came back thinner, quieter, and he never talked about machines again. That evening, back at home, a letter arrived. The envelope was clean, the ink fresh. His father read it slowly, then folded it and placed it on the stove without speaking. The boy asked, "What did it say?" His father didn't look up. Nothing worth reading twice. But that night, the boy saw him pacing the yard, smoking an old cigarette he'd hidden under the porch for years. The next day, the local police officer, not a man who ever visited for friendly reasons, stopped by the farm. He drank tea with the boy's parents in the kitchen and asked a string of polite, sharp-edged questions. "Is your son building anything strange?" "No," said the father. Is he interested in foreign material? Number. Has anyone been speaking to him from outside the village? No, said the mother, but her hand trembled when she poured the tea. When the officer left, silence swallowed the house. Later, the father pulled the boy aside. From now on, he said, no more talking about lying. Not to anyone. But no one. You want to build? Build, but do it with your mouth shut. The boy nodded, and for a while, he obeyed. But he kept building. He wired a new rotor system. He reinforced the frame with steel rods pulled from a collapsed fence. He found an old cassette player and converted its motor to power secondary spin. Piece by piece, the machine began to take shape. Not a toy, not anymore. And outside the shed, the goat stood watch, chewing on a work glove. The cat, half wild and scarred, curled beneath the workbench. The boy spoke to no one, but his thoughts hummed in the wires and spun with the blades. The farm was changing. The country was watching. And somewhere, in some distant office, his name was already on a list. The day the sky noticed me. It wasn't supposed to fly that day. The machine, his third prototype, wasn't finished. The tail rotor was still unstable. The battery casing had cracked, and one of the rear struts was barely holding together with tape and a prayer. But the sky was clear, and something in him whispered, now. It was Sunday. Most of the village had gone to the square for a local market flour, soap, maybe even tinned meat if someone had connections. The farm was quiet. Even the animals seemed to pause, as if sensing something unusual. He rolled the contraption out of the shed. It was heavier than before, a crude skeleton of steel and aluminum, with exposed wiring and a battery rigged from 3 scavenged units. It looked like a mechanical insect, angry and alive. He placed it in the pasture, away from the barns, and checked every connection twice. No audience, no cameras, just him, the machine, and the wind. He connected the wires. The rotors spun. Faster, faster. The grass beneath it flattened. It rose, not by inches, but by feet. 2, then 4, then 6. The tail twisted slightly, compensating. It wobbled in the air, but it stayed. He stepped back, stunned. His shadow overlapped with the machine's bracts. He was flying not inside it, not yet, but in spirit. Then came the sound. A dog barked in the distance. A door slammed. A voice shouted, "What's that?" He turned. 3 boys from school stood at the fence. One ran. The others stared. The machine spun faster. Then snap. The tail rotor cracked. The body tilted sharply, veered left, and slammed into the pasture with a crunch of metal and wire. The rotor shattered. A battery sparked. Smoke rose in thin, embarrassed trails. The boy ran to the wreckage, heart pounding. The casing was twisted, but not burned. The structure had survived worse. He could fix it. He could always fix it. But the moment was broken. He looked up. A woman stood near the barn, not his mother, not a neighbor. She wore a coat too clean for the farm. Her shoes didn't sink in the mud. She held a small notebook, closed. She said nothing, just nodded once, turned, and walked away. That night, they came again. Not the police officer this time, someone else. No uniform, no name. He sat in their kitchen and asked questions with a smile. So the boy is clever, yes? Good with his hands? His father said nothing. Curious minds can be useful, if guided properly. His mother offered tea. The man refused. He left behind a pamphlet, folded, plain cover, 1 word in bold. Program. No details. Just an address. That night, the boy sat outside, on the broken stump where the machine had lifted into air. The stars blinked above him, the same ones he'd looked at since childhood. But now they felt farther away. He had flown. He had been seen. And that, he realized, was the most dangerous thing of all. The pamphlet sat on the kitchen table like a knife. It wasn't thick, just a folded sheet of gray paper printed in clean, sharp letters. It spoke of opportunity, patriotism, and technical advancement for the glory of the state. It promised education, tools, materials, a future. It did not mention control, or silence, or obedience. The boy didn't touch it, but he read every word. Then he read it again. His father didn't speak all evening, just sat by the stove, sharpening a blade that didn't need sharpening. His mother moved slowly, every gesture deliberate, like time had thickened. That night, they talked quietly, behind a closed door. The boy didn't hear words, just tones, fear, anger, defeat. The next morning, his father handed him a sack of tools. If they call again, he said, you go. You smile. You nod. But you don't give them everything. You understand? The boy nodded. His father leaned in close. Not all knowledge should be shared. The next few days passed under a strange kind of waiting. The letter didn't arrive, but eyes did. Strangers at the edge of fields. A man on a bicycle who didn't speak to anyone but passed by twice a day. His teacher, suddenly friendly, offering extra lessons. The boy built nothing, not out of fear but out of strategy. He read, he sketched, he planned, and he listened. The mechanic from the farm pulled him aside one evening. They're watching you. I know. They'll take what you make. They'll twist it, put it in metal shells, drop it from planes. You think they want to help you fly? The boy stayed silent. Do you want to serve, or do you want to build? The boy answered without hesitation. Build. The mechanic looked him over, then handed him a piece of paper with a smudged address. No name, just a place. Not everyone follows the same road, he said. Some of us, we look for cracks in the map. That night, the boy opened an old atlas. He traced the borders with his finger. Paper was worn thin along the western edge. Poland, then Germany, then America. It sounded impossible, but so had flight. Between the fence and the sky, he had never seen the border, but he knew where it was. Maps became his secret companions, hidden behind the shed wall, folded in his pillow, tucked between toolboxes, old-school atlases, smuggled pamphlets, train schedules written in crooked handwriting. He studied them like blueprints for freedom. The world beyond his village wasn't drawn in colors or flags. To him, it was wind, possibility, a place where he could build without asking permission. But first, he had to disappear. He started small. A coil of copper here, a battery there. He hid parts beneath floorboards, behind false walls, even in the goat's abandoned hay trough. She had long since claimed a different corner of the barn. His tools became quieter. He learned how to cut metal without sound, how to pack wire so that it looked like trash. He watched people differently now, measured their eyes. The teacher still smiled too wide. The bicycle man now circled 3 times a day. And the mechanic, he no longer joked. This path doesn't end with applause, the man said one evening. It ends with cold hands and a long walk through places where no one will speak your name. I don't need my name, the boy replied. I need a place to think. The hardest part wasn't planning. It was silence. He couldn't tell his friends, not the 2 boys who used to race him with sleds, not the girl who lent him her pencil that one winter when he had nothing. And he couldn't tell his parents. His mother watched him now with a gaze that knew too much. She never asked, but she began cooking more in the evenings, tucking extra food into jars. For the shed, she'd say. You stay there so long, you'll starve. His father left tools out, sharp and clean. One night, the boy found a wool coat on his workbench, worn, patched, warm. No one said anything, but the goodbye had already begun. Then came the call. Official, printed, signed. You've been accepted into the Youth Technical Advancement Program of the state. Attendance was mandatory. The date was in 10 days. He had less than that. That night, he climbed onto the barn roof and sat beneath the stars. He held the old notebook, the one with his first drawing, a rotor, uneven, wings like blades of grass. He opened it to a blank page and drew a map, not of roads, not of countries, but of wind and silence and the space between fences where a machine could lift, even if only for a moment, before the world noticed. Escape velocity. He left before dawn. No letter, no sound, just the hum of wind and the groan of wood as the old shed door swung open one last time. He wore the coat his father left on the bench. Inside the pocket, 2 pieces of hard bread, 3 matches, and a folded note in his father's hand. "Don't stop, not even once." The prototype was gone, dismantled weeks ago, scattered across the countryside in places only he knew. He wasn't bringing invention with him, just intention. At the village edge, he paused. The goat, silent in the dark, stared at him from her crooked wooden shelter. The cat brushed against his leg, then vanished into the hay. The path through the woods was narrow, but familiar. He traced it dozens of times in his mind, tested the timing, measured the silence. It led past the grain silo, behind the water tower, through the trees that bent westward in the wind. He moved fast, past the fields, past the silent schoolhouse, past the frozen canal where he once tested a propeller with fishing wire and soap. He had 6 hours until his absence would raise questions. 8 until they'd search. 12, if the mechanic stalled the right truck. He crossed the train tracks just before sunrise, heart pounding like a second engine in his chest. He crouched in the reeds, waited for the first passenger train to pass. Its roar shook the earth, a monstrous thing, loud and indifferent. The real border was farther past 2 more towns, through 1 checkpoint, then into the zone where nothing had names, only shadows. He walked, and walked, and walked. By the time the sun reached its peak, his feet bled. By the time it dipped, he'd crossed the second rail line, changed his coat inside out, and hidden his notebook in a hole under a birch tree marked with a knife scratch. Then came the checkpoint. Just 1 man in a small booth. Cigarette, radio playing quietly. The boy stepped into view with a limp and a forged pass provided by someone the mechanic used to know. The guard looked up, squinted. "Where are you headed?" "Relative in the city," the boy lied. The guard held his gaze a second too long, then nodded and waved him through. He didn't run, didn't smile, just walked. The road ahead stretched like a nerve tense, exposed. But he was moving. Out. Away. Toward. When the village awoke the next morning, his name was on every list. 1 word was whispered more than others. Gone. And behind the shed, under a loose board, they later found a notebook. The first page held only 1 line. If man is born under sky, why should he die under ceilings? No flag, no name, just forward. He didn't know exactly when he crossed the line. There was no sign, no fence, no sudden change in air. Just a feeling, a loosening in his chest, like a cord had snapped. He was no longer there. Poland was wet that week. Mud sucked at his boots with every step. The road was cracked and unmarked. Forests loomed on either side like old soldiers, silent and watching. He had no documents, only the forged pass he used at the checkpoint, now burned and scattered into the wind. He avoided towns, slept in barns, drank from streams. One night, he bartered a pocket knife for a ride in a hay cart. The driver didn't ask questions, just glanced once in the mirror and drove. In Krakow, he found the church. It wasn't what he expected. The paint peeled, the bell tower leaned, but the priest inside looked him in the eye and didn't flinch when the boy said, "I need a place for a few days." He stayed a week. In that time, he ate, washed, slept without boots, and wrote pages and pages of diagrams, memories, inventions, questions. He filled the margins with things he couldn't say aloud. How it felt to fly, how it felt to run, how he no longer dreamed in color. The priest gave him a coat. A woman from a nearby aid group came by on Thursday. She spoke English, asked questions. He answered honestly, but not completely. "Do you have family?" "Yes." "Do you want to return?" "Number." "Do you know where you're going?" He hesitated, then said, "Where I can build." 3 weeks later, He was put on a train with others, refugees, defectors, dreamers, some silent, some praying, some clutching bags as if they held their souls. At the German border, there were more forms, more eyes, more waiting. He stood in line for hours. When his turn came, he gave no name. Just a sentence. I can build machines that fly. They looked at him like a boy playing with toys. Then he pulled out the notebook. They read it in silence. The man behind the desk, tall, tired, said only one thing. We'll make a call. In a land where silence wasn't dangerous. The airport smelled like metal and coffee. Too clean, too bright, too fast. He stepped off the plane with one bag, a satchel stuffed with his notebooks, half in grease, half in hope. His coat was too heavy for the climate, but he wore it anyway. It reminded him who he was. America didn't look like freedom, not at first. It looked like motion, screens, doors that opened on their own, loudspeakers barking in 3 languages. People walked fast and didn't look at each other. No one noticed him, and that was the most incredible thing of all. No one watched. They gave him a bed in a center for technical refugees, clean sheets, plastic utensils, food that came in plastic trays. He sat with people from countries he couldn't find on a map, listening to dozens of stories, most full of pain, some full of fire. He didn't talk much, but he drew, every day, for hours, on the back of intake forms, cafeteria napkins, blank printer pages, rotors, wing shapes, battery flow systems. One of the staff, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a name tag that read Linda, started collecting them. You're not just sketching, she said. He shook his head. Number I'm solving. 1 week later, she introduced him to a man from the State Tech Institute, gray-haired, soft-spoken, with a voice like sandpaper and eyes that scanned like a machine. I'm not promising anything, the man said, but show me what you've got. The boy, not a boy anymore, really unrolled his diagrams. The man didn't speak for 10 full minutes. When he finally looked up, he said, This shouldn't be possible. Not with what you had. I had enough, the young man said, because I had no choice. The engineer leaned back. For the first time in his life, the young man saw respect in a stranger's eyes, not suspicion, not caution. Respect. You ever built a full model? Number. Ever used proper tools? Number. The engineer nodded slowly. Well then, let's fix that. The lab was cold, bright, and quiet, but not with fear, with focus. Everything gleamed. Steel tables, tools arranged with machine precision, wires sorted by thickness, color, and potential. It wasn't the shed back home. It wasn't the barn. It was a temple. And for the first time, he felt like a welcomed priest. The engineer, now his mentor, handed him a key card and said, Your mind is ahead of your hands. Let's fix that. He spent days, then nights building, not scavenging, building. He ran tests on lithium cells, designed compact, responsive rotor hubs, 3D printed blade models. He recorded every result, every failure. He corrected angles by millimeters, then by fractions of degrees. They gave him a laptop. He didn't browse the internet. He simulated wind. Weeks passed. His fingers developed new calluses. He stopped counting hours. He stopped translating thoughts he thought in motion now. Then came the morning someone said his name. His real name. He hadn't used it since the escape, not once. He froze. The man who said it was wearing a suit. He didn't look like a scientist or a sponsor. Sorry, the man said. Didn't mean to startle you. Just wanted to confirm your background for security clearance. Where did you get that name? We do our homework. That night, he went back to the lab, Saturday in the dark. There was a letter waiting for him. Not typed, handwritten. You are not forgotten. The motherland remembers its sons. You still have time to return. No punishment, only purpose. No signature. No sender. Only the red wax seal with a hammer and sickle burned faintly into the corner. He crumpled the letter, threw it in the trash, but didn't sleep. Not that night. because something was shifting. Again, not in the lab, not in the wires, in the air. Someone had found him, and someone wanted him back. The letter was never answered. Instead, he built, not from anger, not from fear, from belief. The same belief that once sat beside a frozen well. The same belief that whispered through the cracked boards of an old shed. The belief that flight was not just for birds or empires, but for anyone bold enough to try. Years passed. His name no longer belonged to lists or files or whispered meetings. It belonged to the sky. He built machines that saved lives, machines that mapped forests, machines that flew into storms when humans could not. He shared blueprints with students who reminded him of himself: dirty hands, burning eyes, too many questions. He opened a lab, not guarded by soldiers, but surrounded by windows. He didn't build walls, he built wings. And one day, after the launch of his latest craft, a self-navigating rescue drone, he stood on stage in front of people from a dozen nations. There was applause, photos, lights. But he wasn't looking at them. He was looking up. Above the glass dome, the sky stretched wide, blue, infinite, borderless. After the event, a small boy approached him, maybe 10 years old, awkward, bright-eyed. He held out a crumpled notebook and asked, "Can I have your autograph?" He smiled, took the pen, but he didn't just sign his name. He wrote, "Build, fly, don't wait for permission," then handed the book back. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like he was running anymore. He was flying, revving. Somewhere deep in memory, the wind still howled over a Soviet field. A goat still escaped its pen. A cat still curled under a warm stove. But he had made it, not just across a border, not just into air. He had built a life with no ceiling. The end